The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand. We gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise to get what we want. We got to organize.
Welcome to the Pantsula Podcast, brought to you by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We're all members of the Kaji Work Study Circle, my comrade Jamilah and comrade Jesse. What we're here for this podcast is to advance Pan-Africanism, which we define as the total liberation and unification of the African continent under scientific socialism. So, and as we are proud Africans who remember the entire history of our struggle, we always like to honor a couple of our ancestors. For this episode, we're honoring Gwen Patton and recently transitioned Glen Ford.
I just want to say I don't know much about Comrade Glen Ford. I was watching some videos that Black Agenda Report put up, and I was definitely inspired by his fire and passion for just anti-capitalist ideology. And wow, I'm just like, whoa, those are the type of warriors we don't talk about. So I definitely honor his legacy and look forward to watching more videos of his. And just happy Black August to everyone. So we got to do what we can to remember those in the fight. So yes.
My goodness. So Glen Ford, I'll start with Glen Ford. Glen Ford, I have never met, but I've been familiar with his works for many years. He was one of the folks who was an editor of Black Commentator, and Black Commentator is a publication I've read for years. And when I did radio for 11 years, I used to actually discuss articles or subjects that were written about in Black Commentator. And then, of course, a Black Agenda Report, and he was one of the co-founders or primary founder of Black Agenda Report. And he and Bruce Dixon, so they were, now they're both together wherever they are. But they were two very strong voices in the African tradition of journalism. And Glen Ford was very consistent in his stance against the capitalist political parties, which continue to be prevalent in the United States. I know that there was a lot of disagreements in terms of how people viewed the Green Party, for instance, in Black Agenda Report. But Mr. Glen, he was like, no, we are anti-imperialist, just very much keeping that tradition. And so you had people like Jared Ball, who's been on the show, actually the first episode, come out of that tradition and worked with people like Comrade Glen Ford. And one of the, I think, ways that people came to know Glen Ford was around 2012. So this was after the invasion in Libya and the torture and assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. He'd been talking about this stuff for years, but there was an episode, he was on several episodes of Democracy Now!, but there was an episode of Democracy Now! Where he had, if you want to call it a debate, with Michael Eric Dyson. And yeah. I'm thinking about John Henrik Clarke's statement. He's like, I do not debate people who are not my equals, something to that effect. And so when you had this episode of Democracy Now!, you had, oh my goodness. So I'm just thinking about it and laughing. Michael Eric Dyson. So he is known to be that dude who uses 10-cent words and theorizes and everything, but he used a lot of these 10-cent words to defend Barack Obama. And Glen Ford is just like, okay, here's the actual facts. Like, we don't have to use these words to get around the facts and defend these inhumane policies, these imperialist US policies. This is actually what happened. And if anyone hasn't seen that, please watch that episode. Again, he's been on Russia Today, he's been on Democracy Now!, he's been on a lot of platforms and has been very consistent about being anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, etc. And Glen Ford is very, very beloved in the African journalistic tradition, in the activist and organizing circles. A lot of folks who work and organize with Black Alliance for Peace also have worked with Glen Ford, and he is very, very missed. Again, I didn't personally know him, but when I heard he had passed, I said, wow, you know, I was a little taken aback by that. It's very similar to Baba Lukman's passing. Even though I didn't personally know him, we understood the magnitude of that work they did. And a lot of people, of course, will continue that tradition that people like Glen Ford set in place. Like, we all have to leave this earth. What's more important is that we continue that work. As we continue to say, a lot of sisters don't get shine when it comes to doing this work. And we want to honor our ancestors. We want to honor our comrades in the struggle, whether they are physically here or not. But again, we are honoring the ancestors. And Gwen Patton, she's probably most known as being associated with SNCC, but she was involved in the Montgomery Improvement Association. And as a lot of people we have honored, they have a connection to the Montgomery bus boycott. And there is like in the Panthers, like many organizing circles, many organizing efforts, women and non-men have been at the forefront of that struggle. And Gwen Patton is one of those many people. She also was a member of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And of course, that was the gateway, that was the sort of building block to create the Black Panther Party, as of course, a lot of people know the Black Panther Party. But what came before that was the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. And of course, the connection to SNCC and the Panthers had a heavy anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, pro-mass organizing effort, pro-mass organizing activism, pro-mass organizing tools to use. So, my goodness. So she was also heavily, of course, being anti-imperialist. She did a lot of organizing and activism around anti-war in general. There's the NBA WADU, and so it's one of the many anti-war organizations that existed. And so that focus was on how imperialist wars affect African women around the world. And so she did publish a pamphlet called For Us Women. She discussed the connection between sort of body autonomy and reproductive rights, and how imperialism affects reproductive rights for African women around the world. So she did talk about birth control and eugenics. So she did make a connection there. She talked about the war that women around the world waged against imperialism. So of course, around that time, there was the invasion of Vietnam, and there were many women on the front lines there as well. So she looked at that and said, women fighting and taking up armed struggle against these forces which are inhumane, like this is something that we should be doing. So again, the armed struggle that women took up is something that's not talked about either, but she very much encouraged that. She very much talked about not only waging ideological struggle, but armed struggle against these imperialist forces. Those two, man, just some strong people. And there are so many people that are known and unknown in organizing circles, in the fight against imperialism, the fight against colonialism, neocolonialism, the fight against Zionism, that, we could be here all day naming so many people who waged this fight, and ideological and militarily. And we will continue to do that. We can't name everyone in one episode, but we will continue to honor folks in every episode. So those are the two that we have today. So we have comrades Glen Ford and Gwen Patton presente, and hopefully, many of us will continue your legacy to fight in this war against ideological degradation from capitalist forces, as well as imperialist forces, neocolonial forces, and Zionist forces.
Yep. And speaking of capitalist forces, that's exactly the subject we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about capitalism, socialism, communism, and how we're not all capitalists, and just getting knee deep into what those words mean. Because if you hear those words used, yeah, if you hear those words used in either in a casual conversation or corporate conversation or educational purposes, you'll hear quite a bit that's either very highly simplistic or just plain out wrong. So we're here to we're not saying that we're 100% right, but we're just saying that we gotta get that conversation started so people know what we're talking about when you hear those terms. So let's get on to that. So when you hear capitalism, socialism, communism, what words do you think people bring up when they hear those words versus compared to what they actually mean?
What do you mean you're anti-capitalist? All it means is just trading things. What's wrong with you?
Right. And I have capital. I have a business. So, I mean, of course, I'm benefiting from capitalism because I'm able to have my own money coming in. I don't work for nobody. I make my own money. Nobody's telling me, where my money can come from. I don't have to punch in. I don't have to clock out. I make my own hours. So, yeah, I don't have any problem with it. Oh, this is a great conversation to have because honestly, I remember just when I first joined the organization, my understanding for capitalism or of capitalism was very limited. And I assumed capitalism, I knew it was bad. Like I was never pro-capitalist. I always felt like capitalism was wrong, but I had no idea how far it went and just what political education is necessary to have to really further understand capitalism and socialism and communism and communalism, all these terms, because there's a great deal of confusion, but it's just important to know. I mean, and also I should also acknowledge Kwame Ture, who really made it very simple for me. And it wasn't any oversimplification. It was just like, look, I mean, either a few people own the means of production or everyone owns. And there's just two economic systems, capitalism and socialism. And we can clearly see from a historical perspective and just having an analysis that socialism is definitely way better, superior, and will work as opposed to capitalism, which is constantly still using its domination to confuse and trick us into believing that we gotta work, we should work. And even beyond that, our labor being exploited is justified because there's no other alternative. We're not even almost allowed to dream beyond capitalism. And I think that's what really had me going, like, okay, being a part of this organization and studying understand that capitalism is not simple, but it also is very effective at influencing our minds based off of its dominant. I mean, it's everywhere you go, there's capitalism. And so there's just so much work been done to reinforce its hold. And I think obviously the work we're doing is to just show that we need to go, capitalism is inhumane, capitalism is violence, capitalism is the enemy, and we got to do what we need to do to fight it. But we got to have an ideological process to understand it. And that's what we're going to obviously get into. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing we have to recognize is, as we talk about, capitalism is just trade, right? It's just exchange. But in order to understand the history of capitalism, of socialism, of communism, you have to understand like how they developed materially. That they don't just pop out of nowhere. You don't just come up to someone. You don't just have someone saying, "Oh, here's capitalism. Enjoy." No. Like it developed some way that it was a matter of, and if we'll talk more about the history of capitalism development is, if you actually read into how it came about, it's not a pretty picture, let's just say. So and to think that somehow socialism, communism was somehow so immoral and inhumane that as you talk about, you doing a very like poor historical service to yourself. So if we're talking about the history of capitalism, so let's talk about how capitalism actually developed.
You had the systems of feudalism, because a lot of people think capitalism somehow naturally existed on the face of the earth since the beginning of time. That's impossible. You had to have systems which transferred into another one. So there are still remnants of feudalism. You pay a landlord. That's the remnants of feudalism. So you had feudalism, so you had serfs, and so then of course serfs ended up into slaves because you had kingdoms, but then serfs ended up into slaves, and then you had enslavements to exist under this profit-based economy, which means it transferred into capitalism. But capitalism and industrialization goes hand in hand. And so you continue to have periods of industrialization and modern technology and everything. So capitalism is still able to thrive. And you look at how social media is sort of ubiquitous. It's all over the world. And with the alphabet organizations being able to surveil everyone in the world. So that's how one of the many ways capitalism is able to thrive. Another way, of course, is having military bases. So you have imperialism. So you have capitalism and a vast umbrella of things under that. Patriarchy, that's another way. Capitalism has used religion to great effect to go throughout the whole world in terms of how many places around the world did not necessarily view gender historically, how the West has viewed gender, but now these same places which did not historically view gender in those ways now do view gender in that way due to imperialist forces coming in militarily and then using culture under the system and saying, well, gender, or this is how you should dress, or this is who you should pray to. And so again, you have this system of capitalism, which is very much fueled by technology, and it's able to thrive. And so of course, the next system that you have, because everything's transitory, so obviously people are using the tools of capitalism to create better societies. We are not yet in socialism yet. There have been socialist governments, but you can't say that socialism is a thing that happened and it failed, because in most of these socialist governments, the masses did not own the means of production. So you can't say socialism happened and then it failed, because, okay, where is it? So with capitalism, it's able to thrive through the stealing of land, and it's able to thrive through these technological advances. It's able to thrive because people continue to be surveilled through said technological advances. It's able to thrive because anywhere that has access to this technology has access to this media. And so the world, say for instance, hip hop. So USAID goes and uses hip hop to fuel anti-communism or the anti-Cuban revolution. So those are several ways that capitalism has been able to, I keep saying thrive, but yeah, it's been able to thrive and using a profit margin to do so through either aid, through, again, solid missionary culture, through media.
Right. And I would say the propaganda aspect, I mean, which we all should know, propaganda is the dissemination of information. And seeing as it's constant, capitalism is, like you mentioned, through Hollywood, we have the military, we have surveillance, like all of these adages that are in constant rotation. It's just nonstop. And that's another reason why that thriving happens, because they don't ever sleep. It's 24 hours and they're not going to sleep because they understand that they have to be constant to keep that confusion going. And I think when I had that understanding of it, it made me really see, okay, why are they so against communism? Why is socialism so bad? Why is, Cuban revolution seen as a bad thing? Why are these structures built? And it just peels the layer, right? They understand that this is communism, socialism, people fighting for that's just as constant too. And the people have been making just as much of a noise, but because of the thriving systems of capitalism, that noise is constantly suppressed, and it can make one feel like, oh, we'll never reach a place of socialism. We'll never reach a place where people won't work. But we have history to say that otherwise, I think.
Wait, but Jesse, people are too lazy. If you give people socialism, people are just not going to work, and they're just going to sit there all day.
Right.
And human nature, like if you have socialism, someone's going to want to rule everybody.
Right.
That's why you can't have communism, because it's bound to be totalitarian. How can you say, obviously it won't work? Like, this is human nature. Come on, man.
No. That's what we all hear. That's obviously not based in any truth. When we look at, we can talk about the examples of, I mentioned Cuba because that's a very big one, and I'm just going into more study about and seeing just the war that has been waged and how constant. And that's the difference, is that we have to understand, if capitalism is going to constantly give us this information, showing us and confusing us, we have to be engaged in the process so that we are not, fall into the ookie-dook, because it's very easily to be, persuaded by a form of capitalism that's not exactly what is seen as capitalism. Like it's maybe, what's the word, like crony capitalism, like, that's so, that's the whole point, is like, it's gonna mutate like a virus almost. Like, how can it expand and just find ways to get deeper into our thinking that we're actually not being exploited?
And another point with regards to capitalism is that it's like, what do we talk about? Oh, there's trade. Oh, we had trade before. We had goods and services. But the thing you have to remember is that one of the main things that separates capitalism is the drive for profit and wage labor or wage slavery. And another point we have to recognize is that capitalism itself, as we mentioned before, the capitalism itself didn't all of a sudden come about. That, as Jamilah was saying, that different modes of production come about over time. That capitalism, the bourgeoisie, who are the ruling class right now under capitalism, they weren't always the ruling class. We have the aristocrats, we have the monarchies, and the slaveholders, and so on. And that, again, like if you just think, like, even if you think about the European-centered history, like again, that's another point of regards to the propaganda used, that when people focus on European history, that even like if you think about some of the revolutions that happened, like this 18th, 17th, 18th century, like 18th, 19th century bourgeois revolution against the aristocracy, it took some time for them to become the rulers that they are now. So again, to think that is to somehow have this false memory to say that that's just how we are. That's really ridiculous. And another point is that capitalism, as we'll see, when you think about capitalism in itself, that it developed a whole lot differently depending on where you are. If you look at if you compare the history of capitalism here in the snakes versus here, say in Colombia or in Panama or somewhere else, or it developed a little differently depending on what's available, what like the land, the resources, like how things developed, how the classes came about, and so on. So I think that to use it's funny to say, oh, socialism didn't work because Stalin and Mao, they killed like 8 bajillion people, or they all with the word same or something like that. Talk to people in Chile who had to go live under Pinochet. Talk to the 500,000 or 1 million people killed in Indonesia under Suharto. Talk to all who knows how many millions of people in the Indian subcontinent who died as a result of English imperialism. Think about talk to the Irish. There's so many people you can say, oh yeah, capitalism worked fantastically. No. So
yes, and if you look at the foundation of the snakes and how this country was able to thrive based on enslavement of peoples, based on elimination of peoples, and to say, oh, this is the wealthiest country on earth, how does one think that this wealth was accumulated? It was through stealing of resources around the world, the continuation of stealing said resources around the world. It's through, well, okay, so, how can we make money until the land? Okay, we'll steal people from somewhere and we're not gonna pay them. I mean, that's why they call it wage slavery, because you don't pay someone their worth. Why do you think that billionaires and trillionaires, I don't think Jeff Bezos is a trillionaire at this point, but
a couple of
years. But how is he making thousands upon thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars a minute? It's because of wage slavery. If people were to actually be paid their worth, Jeff Bezos wouldn't have that much money. So to come here because you want to get away from the monarchy, because, well, that was totalitarian to us. We want to get away from that because we want freedom. And then your definition of freedom is having an American Holocaust. Let's keep that real, because that's exactly what it is. And an African Holocaust. Let's keep that real. And so to continue to displace, murder, present sickness onto people, starvation, and the ability to profit off of that, that is where capitalism is thriving. Once again, when there is an inequality of ownership of the means of production, that is where capitalism is allowed to thrive. Why is it that someone can make a product, a phone that is $1,000, and you only get paid $9 an hour? Like, where do you do that at? Under capitalism.
Right. That's a good example.
And you go around the world and people who mine coltan, people who mine the materials in which runs the phone, they don't even have access to those devices. This is where capitalism is thriving, and people are waiting, queuing up for hours just to get this new phone when their other phone works just fine.
And we were just, that's a good point. That reminds me of we were reading in our anti-patriarchy work study, a book, Capital and Accumulation by Maria Mies, and she talks about like, yeah, the producer and the consumer, like that relationship is so divided. We out here, we got the phones, we happy we got the new gadgets, whereas the ones in other countries are the ones producing that, and they don't even have access. So like that unbalanced relationship just shows you like the need to have that necessary correlation. Otherwise, we're just like in our own world, not understanding the international. It's like we're talking about capitalism. Obviously, we talk about imperialism because that's the international stage in which it's able to perform at greater lengths.
International.
Yeah, and also I think that international capital is that as you think it's like the free markets for competition. Again, if you look at capitalism, it relies upon the state apparatus, the police, the military, at the school system, all sorts of things, to the government bureaucracy, in order to make sure that the capitalist ruling class doesn't have to do every single thing. That they can just take like, these workers, they want me to pay for a few dollars an hour to get these bananas, to make these t-shirts, to make these toys, to mine this. It's like, hey, like these people aren't doing anything. Maybe I could get them to like help me out. Or maybe some of the ones that look like the workers, I could have them put the guns to them. Obviously, like, and again, and you also think of how, if you talk about the way that capitalism has come about, that again, as we talk about, capitalism look different in different places. That we'll talk more about neoliberalism, but you've had like the welfare capitalism. You have the regime of France. You have the sort of Rhine capitalism, or you have the troubles in Korea, and so on. So the thing, and the same thing for socialism, that you have various forms of socialism. You go from the utopian socialists, so early mid 19th century, the Leninist, Maoist, anarchist, communists, and collectivists, and all sorts of jamilah, and so on. So you have all sorts of things that you can't just that. But again, even though there are like different types for capitalism, for socialism, yeah, there are different ways that have come about, and different ways that they act. But the difference is, one, about value. Socialism is about things, what's useful for people, what's useful for everyone. So they have that use value. Whereas capitalism is like, okay, how much can I get out of this? Like, if I want people to pay for water, if I want people to pay for their thoughts, if I want to commodify their thoughts, their bodies, so I like that's the main thing. And if I can make as much money from those things, and have people either do the work themselves or be paid very little for it, then that's fine. So that's the thing that people need to remember. And again, it's not something that's just it's not just a pair. It's not just after ether. It is something material.
Your point in terms of how capitalism affects different parts of the world, think about Cochabamba, think about Bolivia, and how Nestle went over there to privatize the water, and it was the people who said, no, you're not going to do that. And they organized in mass to prevent the privatization of water through Nestle. Please, if you don't know anything about that, please study. There are documentaries about it. Please read as much as you can about that. And I was thinking when you were talking about how capitalism affects different parts of the world, also, not just with what happened in Cochabamba, but how everything is centered around European theory, around US theory, how capitalism is addressed, how socialism is addressed, and how communism is addressed. Why people think that socialism and communism don't work, in my view, is because they're viewing it from a European lens. People do not understand how Grenada was attacked because there was a move towards socialism. People have not studied what happened in Chile. People have not studied what happened in Haiti. People have not studied what happened in the global South around how socialism could actually be effective and was effective. People think USSR and China, that's it. And so yes, of course, China is not Europe, but what do people think when they think socialism? Marx. People don't even mention Engels. If it wasn't for Engels, who funded Marx, would you be able to have Marx? I don't know. I mean, Marx would probably still be writing or theorizing, but I think he had some help. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And you want to talk about crossing those class lines, I would say that's something that Engels did, you know. So helping to fund the revolution, I guess. I don't know. But whenever there is a conversation, whether it's opposition or support of communism or socialism, it's guided by a Eurocentric analysis. And I think that is something we need to address. And whenever I see that happening, I'm just like, so are you aware of what happened in Guinea-Bissau? Are you aware of the women's wing, Udamu? Are you aware of the PIGC? Are you aware of Thomas Sankara? Are you, so there were so many movements against anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism that gets ignored around the world. People don't even mention Vietnam, which is interesting, given that the US went straight in there to prevent socialism from happening, but somehow people don't even address Vietnam. I don't even know if people mention Vietnam and France. I don't know, but there have been so many movements waged against socialism and communism at the hands of the US tax dollar that it's amazing that there is not a conversation around how capitalism has affected the whole world. Capitalism is simply not trade, and imperialist war and strategy is a perfect example of that. But people do not address that because they think USSR and China. And that is why it's failed. And Mao Zedong killed 1,050,000 people.
Right.
Like that is where people begin and end in this conversation. I'm like, so let's see, the Belgian government torturing and assassinating Patrice Lumumba. So, okay.
Right.
So let's see. The Israel is now decided to be an observer now with the African Union. Hello. So let's have that conversation. And Muammar Gaddafi was like, no, Israel, get out. And look what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. So let's have that conversation. But to say, well, socialism doesn't work because USSR, that literally makes no sense. That literally makes no sense. And it only makes sense if you are looking myopically at the USSR and China, and you are not looking at the global South. I mean, there's communist parties in India, and not even looking at that. So I think that's something we should address. I don't know if y'all have anything to say about that, but I just think that when people have this conversation, it tends to be from a Eurocentric lens.
Absolutely. I would just have to say, Patrice Lumumba and all of the comrades in Africa from Kwame Nkrumah and onwards, those are not names that are mentioned. You really, as you said, it's just stuck in that framework, that European framework. And it's almost like we're not allowed to, it's like what Kwame Ture said, like socialism couldn't be invented. Like the concept, the principles and the formulations of socialism can be studied anywhere in the world. You don't have to have somebody calling it theirs, although obviously Marx and Engels formulated it and they articulated it, but those principles can be found and grasped anywhere. But there is just that eraser there, and it's just not the focus. And anytime mean, thankfully, this organization, the All African People Revolutionary, have already, the work study we do is to constantly engage in learning about these histories so that we don't have the absentee mindset. Because I know for sure, before I even joined the party, I had no idea that there were all of these separate, just people in all parts of the world fighting against it. I had this local frame like, oh, that's just happening out there. It's like, no, this is everywhere. The people are everywhere.
And another point, even when talking about the Soviet Union and China, that even then there is this sort of like, oh, it didn't work there. But even if you look within those places, like, yeah, there were contradictions, sure, but a lot of people, it did work for the masses of people, and again, you think about what both places had to go through for the Soviet Union had from a long reign of the SARS and suppression of vast minorities, especially vast minorities of minorities or colonized people that had to deal with the SARS rule, and then even like leading up to the formation of the Soviet Union, you had something like that's hardly talked about. Like people like talk about, even if they talk about World War I, they say, "Oh, Franz Ferdinand got shot and there was war," and yeah, and then but you don't talk about like Russia, like Russia and like just the Soviet Union generally. It had like a mass invasion of like 14 countries. Like 14 countries invaded that large area. Like, do you know? People know that? Like it's just like, oh, Lenin, Stalin, like cold push, but like it just out of nowhere. Like they got wrecked. Like a lot, they got wrecked. Like that invasion, and later on, like people talk about World War II, you don't hear as much about like the Eastern Front and how like things like 20 million Soviet like soldiers were killed in that time. Not to mention like the blockade, it was then called Stalingrad, and all that, like Operation Barbarossa and so on. Like, and then you speak about China, you hear about, you think about how like the open wars of the different invasions there, and like how long the struggle between the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party. They had to struggle against the dynasty, had the whole dynasties and what this and like again like you heard, like about like the snakes developed, like people don't talk about the snakes, like about like slavery, indigenous genocide, blah, blah, blah. Like but Stalin, but Mao.
Right. Well, even the slavery or the Native American attempted genocide and the land grab and the laws that have been made, yeah, like that, it's conveniently left out.
The thing that any person who says they are anti-racist should understand is the connection between capitalism and white supremacy, or fascism and white supremacy. I know people, Germany. And people say, well, Germany and the Nazis, that was socialist. No, they, just like capitalism does, they understand to use the language of socialism because it connects with people. There were socialist parties in Germany prior to the foundation of the SS. And it was the German Workers' Party, whatever. And then so it developed into an anti-socialist movement, and Hitler was very much like, we're going to use this language because we understand there is a move towards socialism. And the thing about fascism, as is neoliberalism, is that it prioritizes privatization. So utilizing the language of the people, which is what the Nazis did, and then turned it on the people, and then used the language of racial hierarchies in order to get the people to win their hearts and minds. And so the same thing happened in the foundation of the snakes, where you had indentured servants and you had people who were enslaved who were fighting against massa. So they were like, oh, what? We're not being valued for our work or whatever. And they're like, okay, how can we do this? White, we'll create white. We'll establish this sense of whiteness so people will go, oh, I'm going to fight against you. And then you had the foundation of the KKK. And so all of this stuff came out of that because they understood the people knew what was bigger, and it was the people's power. But they had to create language. They had to create these systems which were based in white supremacy in order to maintain and uphold their hierarchy. And I think anyone who says they are anti-racist or I'm not racist or whatever people use, they need to understand that connection. So if you claim to be anti-racist, you must be anti-capitalist. You must be anti-imperialist. You must be anti-Zionist.
Right.
Do not say you are anti-racist and say, well, I don't think capitalism's that bad. One of the primary branches of capitalism is white supremacy. And those are examples. You're using the language of the people in order to maintain a hierarchy, a racial hierarchy, because again, people were getting together and go, our labor is being exploited. Yo, what's up? Like, you know, and then they're like, wait, but I'm white, I'm better than you. And that is what's encouraged to this.
Wow.
And so I think that's just an example that needs to be used. If you claim to be anti-racist, don't come to me saying like capitalism is okay. Because I'm not chilling with that. So anti-racist, you gotta be anti-capitalist. That's just no way around it.
And another point regarding fascists and capitalists, yes, like fascists, like they do have, there is some like antagonistic relations between fascists and capitalists. However, if you look at the history of fascism, you look at the way that like especially like large businesses and the snakes looked at Mussolini. They looked at Mussolini. They thought, oh, like he's dealing with these communists, these laborers, these anarchists. Like he's putting them down. He's like they're like, oh no, like, we kind of like this. And the same thing with Hitler. Like they're like businesses were like if you think about, like we're talking about Henry Ford, the Prescott Bush. If you read like some stuff like The Splendid Blonde Beast, it talks a lot about how some of those businesses, like it talks about the businesses' involvement in Nazi Germany, as well as making sure that all the stuff against like Jewish people, against Romanis, against disabled people, against like LGBT people, against like Afro-Germans, like that sucks. But like got all the slave labor, all this prison labor, like oh okay, it's like I like, and then like after World War II, it's like it's like IG Farben or IBM and Fanta and Hugo Boss, like y'all involved with the Nazis, right? And it's like like you want to give some money, like what about the Dulles brothers? Yeah, we're good.
To put it short, again, I'm a huge fan, even though I talk a lot and write a lot, I'm a huge fan of when having these conversations, having a 10-second definition, because I'm sure just like you, I run into people who say, I'm a capitalist. I run into people who say capitalism doesn't work. I run into people who say, well, if you're anti-capitalist, how come you have a job? So I'm a person who enjoys the 10-second definition. So when somebody says I'm a capitalist, I usually go, do you own any capital? They go, no. I'm like, you can't be a capitalist. When somebody says that the state or communism means the state runs everything and you get rations, like communism means the elimination of the state. So how can you
Right.
how can you say that capitalism or communism means the state? And in terms of socialism, it's very similar to what you introed with Kwame Ture talking about. It's either the masses of the people have ownership of the means of production or a few people. Capitalism is when the few people own the means of production, and socialism is when the masses do. Yes, there can be some assistance from the state because, again, it is a transitory period to get to communism. Yay! So if you're in this system of capitalism, it's not going to go away in a day. So when you have, programs to assist the masses, eventually those programs are going to go away when people have their material needs met, and you do not need said programs. But to say that socialism equals the state giving you everything, it's like that doesn't mean anything, because you're dependent upon a paycheck for your material needs. Like, that's better than the state assisting you with free breakfast. Like, how is that worse than you being 2 paychecks away from getting evicted? Just tell me. I don't know what y'all conversations are like when people tell you that stuff.
I hear that often. Like, how could you be a socialist and you work? Like, you still buy things. Like, the dialectical understanding is often missed. People don't see, like, well, we have to work. I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, capitalism makes it to where if you don't work, we're going to be homeless. But that's what we're fighting against. It's not like, I mean, understanding the dialectical understanding of it, it just puts in perspective why it is the case. It's not to say just because we're working that we are capitalists and yay, capitalism. It's like, no, I mean, we gotta work, but eventually we're working to get to a place where it's just not something that we're doing.
And also, if you want to get that into that game of, you got a phone, you got a smartphone, or you got a computer or something, and like, how can you be socialist? But if you think about in the development of capitalism, like if you're a merchant or some kind of like a merchant at the time, or a large merchant, and you say, I'm sick of the king, I'm sick of the emir, I'm sick of this, like, but you're getting your land from the serfs, you're getting all your food from the serfs, and how can you be against that? Like, I don't get this. Forsooth, this makes no sense. But so again, like everything has a or you think like it's slave like, I don't want for this plantation, like, but they get you clothes, she gives you clothes, and you get food, and so if you break it down like that, then all the, and it's like sort of like a gotcha game, like it falls apart, like because it does not take into account contradictions there. So, and as I spoke about earlier, that like socialism like has a history as well, that it's about like people, like mass people only means introduction. Like it means like we have the land, like think about if you're in a building and you have to pay rent, or in a house or somewhere and you have to pay a mortgage, you don't own that thing unless you don't own that thing. Right. So it's right. Someone owns that, like the factory, the mines, all the transports. Like if does your family own it, or is it owned by a Rockefeller? Is it owned by the Kochs? Is it owned by Bloomberg? Is it owned by Gates, or like owned by Bezos? Like if you have to think about like how, or like the bank you see, do you own that bank? No. So, and as we say, socialism, like when we want to say, oh, some issue with our land, okay, we take care of it. And if there's some issue with the way work's going, I don't have to like speak to a supervisor and say, oh, you don't like how I work? Okay, bye. like you don't have control of that workplace. You can tell, you say the hours, you can, and if you think, well, I have meetings, but the thing is, like, in the end, you don't really, like, even if you make suggestions, they take your suggestions, they can still say, there's not much you can do because my boss's boss told me that you have to do this. So
the misinterpretation that socialism and communism are one and the same. A lot of people use socialism and communism interchangeably and say, well, the state just gives you everything, it's communism. So which one is it? Make up your mind, because they're not the same. they're in the same family because they're against capitalism, but one is a mass objective and the other one is a tactic to get to that objective. And that's probably, again, the 10-second answer. And again, people look at both of them from this European framework and look at it from extremes and don't look at it dialectically. Everything is going to have its contradictions. There's going to be a positive and negative to all of these things, and people are going to make a lot of mistakes to get there. But to get to this point where it's all or nothing, and that's something that capitalism has trained us to advocate for. It's like, if I'm not getting what I want and this other person is getting what they want, I'm going to strive for getting what they want, as opposed to both of us benefiting. And that's capitalism. It's like, oh, I see this person and I'm going to admire and worship and idolize them to get to that point. And this is, getting to the idea of honoring ancestors. Even when people say, well, oh, that's so sad they're gone, we're not going to have another person like this. Like, no, the whole point in the work they did is so we can continue that work. But capitalism has trained many of us, even who are anti-capitalist, to be like, well, we can't do that work. We can't be as good at that work as them. Mm-hmm. Without acknowledging they made mistakes to get to that point too. And they, until the day they left this earth, continued to make those mistakes, and we will continue to make those mistakes. But what's most important is, are we continuing that work? We should never in these movements look at this person is here and we're here. Right. Because we all leave. And so when it comes to systems, I think capitalism also informs us that socialism and communism are totalitarian, because capitalism is totalitarian. And what do you mean by that? There's not one person that rules. When you have a system that steals resources, steals land, and assures that democratic governments don't exist, yeah, I would say that's pretty totalitarian. And when you encourage actual totalitarian governments to be employed in an ex-democratic system, I would say that is totalitarianism, or at least encouraging it, or at least having tax dollars pay for that. Absolutely. And just hearing you talk reminded me of just how capitalism uses individualism as the main thing, where it's just like, yeah, it's me. I'm the only one. We're not really given the perspective of the collective. That's just seen as, we hear things like, oh, you don't need to ask anyone for help. You got to do it on your own. Like all of these common adages that we are taught in terms of like, if we need help, we're afraid to ask because we don't want to feel like it's going to, even being in this organization, it's like, that's one of the things we say, if you need help, ask, just say it. Like, it's not capitalism. If you can't do it, just say something. But we're so trained to feel like we are destabilized. We don't have the ability. And that's just some of the things that capitalism constantly does, just misleading us, understanding that we can collectively gather. And it doesn't take more than 2 people. I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, we can get a lot of work done if we set our mind to that focus. But if we assume that we got to get in line, we got to get the bag, we got to climb this ladder, then we're going to just be misled continually. And then that division just expands. To your point about getting the bag, I think a lot about these YouTube content creators and how some of them are like, I made so much money, I'm giving it away. And you look at the comments, man, that person is so good. They do so much more than the government. It's just right. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So, right. Yeah. That person's an individual. Google, Alphabet, etc. have somehow decided their content is good enough to give them somewhat of a wage, I guess, because they make money off of some of these videos and then advertising dollars and stuff like that. I guess they are ad friendly enough. And then they make a ton of money and they go on crowd funding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So people are it's still the people that are contributing to folks, individuals, being able to give away money. And so again, it still comes down to the people. It's the people who watch that content, in which Google, Alphabet, YouTube, all these other networks have deemed it ad friendly because of not only views but marketing. And again, it's the people doing that. And then they're giving away money. Oh, I saw this one where I wrecked somebody's car and gave them a new one. It's like, where are you getting all of this money? So then it comes with this idea that people have come to see content creators as producing generational wealth. And I'm like, that's not how it works. They may have enough money in this point in time, but they are not the Rockefellers. They are not the Rothschilds. They are not, they don't come from a lineage of stealing land. They don't come from the legacy of stealing people's labor. So how long is that wealth gonna last? There's a huge difference between being rich and being wealthy. And again, this is where people even get capital wrong. Like, the capital is that extra money that you are able to have. Like, if you start a business or whatever, that's why you have what's the venture capitalism. Like, venture capitalism is there because people don't have the capital themselves to start businesses. But you have people like Elon Musk, you have people who got money from their parents, who had enough money to save to provide that money so their kids could start businesses. That's where the capital is, not someone making videos on YouTube and be like, hey, I'm rich, I can give you money. That money is gonna run out at some point as an individual. Maybe, they have now produced a legacy where they are able to have capital, but that's very rare. Most content creators are not wealthy. And we have to really stop this conversation about wealth and being rich as, again, as I said, being interchangeable. It's not. And that goes with your point, Jesse, about individualism. Like, our individual actions, we may produce a lot of money or whatever, but how much is that helping the masses own the means of production? I am happy I live in my 8 houses or whatever, but why are those houses empty when there's houseless people? Like, there was something about, was it Jay-Z and Beyonce's house in New Orleans getting burnt or whatever? And come to find out, the neighbor was like, oh, they haven't been here in 2 years. Why are they having unoccupied space?
Right.
When they get, like, there could be houseless people there. Like, I support the squatters in the UK where they're like, oh, these houses are okay on the market or whatever, we're gonna fill in with houseless people. I'm being upfront, and I support that, because obviously people leave these houses empty because they're trying to generate wealth. Like, the longer you keep a place, the more it's going to be worth or whatever. So you keep it empty, you don't occupy it. And yeah, so I get why people are doing it, but these same people also have to understand there is a shortage. It's not even a housing shortage, there's housing inequities because people cannot afford to live in these houses. So you have your 8 houses all over the world and people out here in the streets. It's just, right. So to say, well, people are providing businesses or whatever, you're still exploiting labor. You still have empty houses that you're not occupying because you're trying to generate wealth off these houses. And so that's the whole thing about the dream and people owning houses, even though they don't, as you mentioned, is the banks own the house. This idea that that's how we're going to generate wealth. The thing is, we don't have capital, so you're
but
limited amount.
We gotta have a savings account.
A what?
A savings account. if we don't have a
Like, I have a savings account. I don't have that much money in it.
right. You hear that a lot, like, oh, you got to at least have a savings account. You can have a savings account, but what if something happens and you need that money?
Exactly.
then that's just literally what happens. Then you have to start over. I mean, it's like
medical emergencies happen all the time.
All the time.
And people have to fight between getting that medical service or paying their mortgage. This happens way too often. So people have to choose between eating food and getting medical care.
Right.
So to say that, oh, the US has the best medical system, no, it doesn't. When there's still inequity, the fact that you have to pay a penalty for not having insurance, make sense. So
right.
And even if you want to say, oh, that's the snakes, they like people here from outside the snakes, they hear about the medical system, they think, well, it's not like that in France, it's not like that in
Sweden.
Like so even those places, they still rely on the exploitation of labor, not only within the nation but within to places where they might, especially now, whether from previously from the capital built up from the triangle trade, and as well as current imperialism and colonization and neocolonialism, they built up well from that. So as a tweet I saw is talking about the Dutch have such great infrastructure. It's so wonderful. But okay, what about Indonesia? What about Suriname? What about the places that the Dutch were there before? They're just going. They're still trying to build the infrastructure up, but as a result of that, you get to smoke some ganja out in the red light district in Amsterdam.
Right, and that just brings me to the book we read, obviously by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I mean, if we're going to talk about America being the richest or any of these nations being rich, we got to talk about the underdevelopment that went into the countries. Let's
talk about how capitalism is not an inevitability. And I mean, we're already seeing that, but let's talk about it.
It wasn't inevitable. I got this mentioned before that the way that this developed in the United States, it developed in part because one from the ruthlessness of and viciousness in order to dedication in order to take all this land, all this labor, or take all what people who stewards of the land, and turning that into ways to collect as much wealth as possible, and think about how about there that one fortunate, if you want to call it, thing about the snakes is that they didn't have the same amount of mineral, same extent of mineral wealth that was there was now called South America, Central America. That if it did have the same amount, then the United States wouldn't have developed the same way. Obviously, you don't. Obviously, can't go back and say, oh, let's run that back. But again, the reason why Brazil didn't develop the way that snakes did, or Chile didn't develop the way so on, is because of the differences of we're able to make all that gold, all that silver, all the platinum, and so on. Whereas here, you have this large protection, you have all this space to farm, to this, and again, it wasn't inevitable that it would be the way it is. If some things happen a little differently, who knows what it looked like now? So, and not to mention, once it did develop, one funny thing is we're talking, especially some of the neoliberal ideologies that, and not just in the, but also in some places in Europe, that there was a battle between those who want to protect their industries and those who want free trade. So, and for a long time, if you're talking about free trade in the United States, the people get a little weird. Like, why would you want free trade? Like, don't you want to build this business? And again, like it sort of switches between like depending on like what works best for those in role. So again, it all depends on like what happened. And as we mentioned before, that when other places wanted to decide, you know what, we want to build our businesses because it took all this land, all these minerals, all these people from let's try. You want to do it to benefit ourselves. Like, no. It's free competition. Come on. There's like IMS here, World Bank's here. So again, like all this stuff, it wasn't an inevitable thing. It just all these circumstances come together, and understanding that makes you understand that with regards to, you ever see those charts where they say it's like, oh, this country's so free, like free business, you can make business all in one. But if everyone did what other places did, then it look a whole lot different. So it's that interconnection has to take into account. So yeah.
And speaking of free trade and all the stuff, a lot of people also think that neoliberalism and capitalism are separate. And one thing I saw, somebody said, oh, all this time I thought I was anti-capitalist, but come to find out I was anti-neoliberalism. And I'm like, but it's capitalism is the root which bore the tree, which has
the fruit of
neoliberalism and the fruits of white supremacy, of patriarchy, of neoliberalism, of all these forces. And so to say that those are separate, it never made any sense to me, because neoliberalism heavily supports privatization. It supports austerity programs. I mean, look at what Reagan and Thatcher did, and how anti-union Margaret Thatcher was. It was like when she physically left this earth, the masses of people were like, woo, and the number one song on the radio was like, Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead.
Exactly.
People were very, pleased to say the least. There's that band Chumbawamba, they actually made an album prior to her leaving, and they said like, we're gonna release it like when she goes, and that's what they did. But I mean, there were many folks in various movements that's similar to Bolsonaro right now. People on the left and the right don't support Bolsonaro based on the government's treatment of COVID. But it's funny, like, oh, the fascist government of Bolsonaro, so that didn't matter to people? Like, don't you think that goes hand in hand with how the response to COVID was? Like, people aren't seeing those connections because people are separating neoliberalism and capitalism. So it's like, capitalism's okay, it's just trade, but neoliberalism, wait a minute. So I think people need to understand that the tree itself is capitalism, and its roots bore the fruits or the branches of all of these other things which separate us. And so we really have to put those things together.
Well, I mean, neoliberalism is, I think, the most dominant way we get a lot of our information on the media. It's a lot of like, there's no accountability. It's just kind of like airy, fairy type of whatever you want it to be. But then when you actually have the real questions and you challenge, like, okay, but what is this saying to history? Where's the analysis there? And then there's that emptiness, because it allows, I mean, I think of someone like Joe Rogan. And I say Joe Rogan because I remember when I first, a lot of people were watching this podcast and just listening to, or finding themselves in some sort of political conversation. And when you really talk about capitalism, or you go to the real root of like the issues, usually the general response is, and I'm not saying this is necessarily an adage of neoliberalism, but it would be just kind of like, no, that's not the focus. Like, let's go back to, the headline. We want, if we're going to talk about Medicare for all and all of these things that the people need, we got to talk about why we're in an empire. America's an empire. So it's the reason why we're not getting that stuff. But a lot of those answers are never really given if you're given a neoliberal framework, because it's not really attainable. It's just kind of like, there's a great piece that Evan, actually, you sent it to us in our anti-patriarchy group. I'm not sure the author, but I believe it's Smash Neoliberalism, where it just kind of goes into the ways it works. I just find neoliberalism to be one of the common ways of how we get a lot of our politics, to not really challenge what's real, just focus on just kind of like not looking at the substance.
I think as far as like people usually neoliberalism, like Bill Clinton's a neoliberal, Tony Blair's a neoliberal. So again, like one of the things about that, one thing is about privatization. It's about deregulation. It's about reducing subsidies on like you talk about, like reducing subsidies, like making the dollar freer, and like free trade, and making sure that whatever the market does, or whatever the market supports, that's what's best. And if you like we talked about Maggie Thatcher's like there is no alternative. There is, like they basically saying that there is no alternative than to rely on the whims of capital to say to release any sort of like bonds of actually doing some like social democratic ideals, like giving some like Medicaid or healthcare or stuff like that, or like social housing or free college. And it's like you should, like if you want college to be something, you should have to pay for it. Or if you want medical care that you're worth, you should pay for it. And it's obviously like we talk about the specific ideas, and I've been in books about like the development of neoliberalism, and funny thing is, for a while, like neoliberalism, like people look at neoliberalism like, is this a joke? But then we saw like the crises happening during the 70s of like the oil embargoes, and like inflation, and like all this what's all this stuff worth, and then like people can work, and then it's like, you know what, like let's just make this thing work. Let's just let this thing fly. And it's like, if you want to build your country, or you want to make some real money, like let that free market work. And obviously, of course, like, there are lots of people like no, like it's like labor, like you have the labor capital government, like sort of the Fordist compromise you had for like from post-World War II to the 70s, and the Bretton Woods institutions, like to make sure that it's like, those extremes of like, we can't have fascism, we can't have communism, like we got we don't want these people to have any fancy ideas. Like let's settle things down. When you think of these bosses, like we know you don't like all these unions, but come on, like, do you really want these like workers or peasants and so on to like really get on you? No, like when you look at the workers, like you want them, but if that happens, we don't like. Do you want to be communists? Do you want all these like pinkos to come and get you? No. And so you take advantage of the colonies that's still there. Even if countries become independent, you still have those like economic and political relationships. And as I said, the 70s came, and it's like, let's just make sure the banks and the finance capital have all that control, and like labor, like all the work you're doing, all the work that is informal labor, whatever. Like, if you want to pay for it, just put some on credit. And if you're a country that You think you want to develop your infrastructure, you want to develop your labor, just cut and do all that stuff. So again, it's so it's just ugly. Let's just say.
The other way capitalism thrives is through loans. So you have IMF, World Bank, you have credit card debt. So people, of course, do not pay their bills and they rack up interest fees, they rack up debt, and then, they're utilizing all of these ways to generate means to profit from that. And I think that cutting the programs, doing all of these things through neoliberalism, I think those are other tools that are used. And, getting to capitalism itself, I think people inherently understand how inhumane capitalism is, but they separate themselves from that reality because people complain all the time about capitalism.
Right.
They're like, man, I need to make this money so I can pay my rent next month. Man, I don't know how I'm gonna eat tonight. Man, I got these student loans racking up. Man, so people understand it on an intrinsic level, but when it comes to the bigger picture of how to counteract that, people don't see it because capitalism encourages us, as y'all have mentioned, capitalism focuses on the individual. And so we are also focused on our individual lives, but do not understand how all of our lives are interconnected. Not only do you have credit card debt, but countries have debt because they were like, okay, we'll give you this loan or whatever, wink. And then, oh, you can't pay it back? Okay, we'll jump the interest on that. Oh, you're going to have to pay back from fighting for your liberation. Oh, we're going to rack up interest for that. So they do all these things and people having to continue a cycle of wage slavery to pay back loans. So you don't think about fighting for the people's liberation.
You're right.
This cycle. And so people think about their individual lives and like, I don't have time to fight.
Right.
What do you mean? I can't fight. I got to pay my bills. Instead of, again, looking at the larger picture, people are experiencing way bigger than that. Like they just got their house bulldozed. They don't have a house. And I know, you're 2 paychecks away from being houseless, but they literally had the military, the IDF come in and bulldoze their house and they couldn't say anything about it. So people all over the world are fighting these battles. And some people are fighting a war, but we have our daily battles. But there's there's other people, well, I got my kids to take care of and I don't know. And it's like people with 5 kids being like, what's up? You going to step in front of this house? You going
right. Yeah.
What's up? So, people understand what's at stake. And as I said, the last episode, people around the world, not in the US, understand the relationship to imperialism, and it's not a positive one. People don't have that understanding because, again, what do they watch? CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, BBC, NPR. There's really not that connection to how imperialism impacts all of us negatively. It especially impacts us who are in the snakes, because not only are tax dollars paying for it, it really impacts us ideologically because well, it's for the greater good, isn't it? There was, what's that guy who's this right-wing guy, Mark Dice. So he actually did a documentary, and it was a very interesting documentary. It was like a mini documentary. So he went to Times Square, and this was, I think, Obama was in the White House. It was literally the White House, literally and figuratively. But so he went, and of course, I forget which imperialist war it was at that time. They go into Syria. I don't remember. But So Mark Dice goes to folks in Times Square and talks about what people deem Republican policies. So this war here, this war, and people, that sucks. Oh, he needs to be impeached, all of this, whatever. And he said, okay, let me tell you, I actually did kind of lie. These are Obama policies. And the mental gymnastics people utilize in order to defend Obama policies. That's why it's interesting. Yes, you got to look.
I want to watch that now. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, because the mental gymnastics. Well, it was for the greater good. But when you just said it was Bush, you said, oh, no, he needs to be impeached. It's the same exact policies. So people sort of separate based on their individual feelings about a person or a situation, and based on whatever their ideological framework is or their political framework. And it's the same thing with like capitalism and nihilism. Like capitalism isn't that bad because it's trade versus neoliberalism. Oh no, look at what neoliberalism does. People do not seem to be able to make that connection because we've been trained our whole lives since we've come out of the womb that capitalism is okay. All it needs to do is be fixed. It just needs a Band-Aid over it. It just needs to be tweaked. What the problem is crony capitalism. What's the problem?
The bad guys, the ones who are rich, who just want to be greedy, who take it for themselves. Those are the
right. So yeah, if you get rid of crony capitalism, then you can have proper capitalism. And again, these people are not looking at, as what you said, Evan, that capitalism affects the world. Capitalist policies affect the world. Imperialist policies affect the world. And so we have to be able to make those connections. We have to be able to make those historical connections because the history is what guides what happens today. And I don't think, if you don't learn from your mistakes, you're doomed to repeat it. I don't even think that's necessarily the case. Capitalism understands that change is the only constant. So what do? They utilize these methods and follow technology. So what do? As mentioned earlier, they utilize social media. So it's not even utilizing the same mistake. It's just rolling with the times and making sure people, you have their hearts and minds. And so capitalism has gotten the hearts and minds of people to the point where it's like, oh no, it can be fixed, right? It can be fixed. And one thing I wanted to talk about the episode about color revolutions and didn't get to is the whole the women's march that happened with the pink hats, and how capitalism definitely utilized that and individualized the situation to be about Trump. So it was about that I'm not going to repeat the phrase, but it was like Trump grabbing people. Y'all know, like people watching this know what he said. I don't have to repeat it. But that is what people focused on. So they had these pink hats. And so, of course, that was a marketing tool to be like, women's march. And then, of course, you had people like here and there talk about different issues, but it focused on getting Trump out of office. That was the focus, as opposed to US imperialism, which promotes the same thing you're talking about Trump. It promotes patriarchy. It promotes assault. It promotes rape. What do you think happens when the military goes in? Like the UN troops went in, and that's what happened in Haiti. Like these assaults happened. So to say, well, this thing, we're wearing pink hats because we want Trump out, without understanding that the system bred Trump. The system of capitalism, patriarchy, bred people like Trump. And if you don't address that, then you, in my view, are going to be seen as a color revolution, because that did get taken over. Yeah, it was like millions of people around the world, millions of people. But again, the people around the world, in my view, from what I saw, understood that connection, that Trump was representative of US imperialism. They did not separate those two things. So when people around the world outside of the snake said, Trump, get out, they knew what that meant. But people here were like, I'm gonna wear a pink hat for Trump. It did become a color revolution, literally and figuratively, in my view, because it still did not address these larger issues. And it got taken over by capitalist media and was like, yay, Women's March. So we can't not address these issues.
Hillary would have solved patriarchy.
Yeah. How are you gonna be like, get rid of Trump? And like, y'all didn't say get rid of Bill Clinton. Like, I mean, he literally like utilized his power to, get what he wanted out of someone who worked in his office. But yeah, y'all didn't have marches about that. So yeah, it's just like that Trump, I do feel like Trump was, things happen for a reason. And Trump, because he's a narcissist, it was like, oh, we're able to mold him. He was like a narcissist and understood his role. And so he was malleable enough to be able to like, whatever, I'm just gonna say anything I want or whatever. And they got what they wanted. And I think for me, Trump really brought forth what this country represented, the history and the present tense. So I'm just like, thanks, Trump, whatever. But again, it is larger than Trump. It is a system that Trump represents. And if we do not understand that, you're going to continue to have these singular women's marches being like, get the president out or whatever. It's just like, no, they get rid of the system that bred Trump. And we can't, like, what is this? And like, and what happened? Like, most people, I guarantee you, are not in organizations that were at that march. Yeah, there were some folks, like, I know that, I mean, you can heavily critique her now, but Tamika Mallory, who was one of the founders of the Women's March, she was organizing, I'm just saying. So, but the majority of people who were at that march, particularly in the US, I guarantee you, most of those people are not in organizations. They were at that march because they wanted to get Trump out. And they did not make the connections between Trump and that system that bred him.
Which is why people like Obama or Kamala Harris or anyone, somebody that looks like they could be our Democrats, essentially, it's like, oh no, we got it. Trump isn't there. We don't have to pay attention to the actual tree that produces this soiled fruit that we get. We just can focus on the spoiled grape and then not even worry about the roots. I mean, that's just what's happening. Just a complete dismissal of the actual tree that's producing what we're getting, those spoiled fruits.
And then Biden wasn't, there were some folks that came out and said he was an assaulter. I feel like that.
Yeah, right. That story just, where did it go? And there's plenty of videos where you see his just inappropriate, creepy interactions.
And you saw people say, like, oh, Trump said that Biden, she just why she bring up now, or why she did this, and why you sound like the same people, or again, like Bloomberg when he bought himself into the race, that it's like you see people like, oh, there's someone who can take him, like I live in New York on Bloomberg. That guy, I don't like that guy. It's just there's a lot I can say, but I want this video to be up. So,
well,
and there you have it.
You and I grew up in New York, Evan. Like, we could talk about the Cuomos. A lot of people. And same thing that happened with Trump. So anybody from NYC was like, Trump, why y'all like Trump? Same thing, Giuliani, America's mayor. Well, it's just like, we're from New York. What y'all see in Giuliani? This is the same dude who was at City Hall with the cops, had watermelons. This was like around the time of Dinkins. So Giuliani was running and cops had watermelons. And I mean, that dude from the start was a white supremacist. And then people were like, America's mayor, because, what happened in 2001. And so being from NYC, we were like, what? And so the same thing with the Cuomos where they were heavily anti-union. I mean, there's a whole history about the Cuomos that we could get into here. That's going to be a long episode. But what's that one dude on MSNBC? Oh, he's dreamy, and you know, everybody supported that guy. And then there was again the accounts of abuse and utilization of power that came out. And so, you know, all this stuff were the legacies of the Giulianis, the Cuomos, the Trumps, like long histories that if you are in that environment understood to be negative and not for humanity, but somehow because America is about individualism, it's just like, I remember that stuff being on the news. It was on the news at the time, but you know, this was before the proliferation of cable news and everything. But also people, well, Trump, you know, what did he ever do that was racist? There was in the late 70s a lawsuit, a federal lawsuit against Donald Trump because he would not sell any of his apartments to African folks. I mean, right there. I mean, there was come on. So his father was a slumlord. You could even talk about the, you know, Central Park, and it's called the Exonerated Five. He put up money to put ads in the New York Times and other publications.
He wanted them hanged.
Not being evidence to say that they should get the death penalty. And when they were exonerated, he was like, eh. So how can you not say there's something up with that guy? Like, he has proven time and time again. And if you are from New York, and if you've been following him, you know that. But this just shows again how people separate the existence of capitalism from individual situations. And for people to say that, you know, Trump is for the people, are you kidding me? His father was a slumlord. You don't think he continued that? How can you be for the people if you're a slumlord? If you own
small
property,
$100,000, small $1 million loan, what
right.
$100,000 or whatever.
Right.
Yeah,
so
for the
how
people.
can you? Yeah, if his interests are to uphold profit from realty or whatever, how can you say he's for the people who's going to drain the swamp? Like, none of that made sense to me. Again, that dude has a long history, and he was a celebrity in the 80s, and people knew about him. Like, people knew about Trump Tower or whatever, so people can't say they didn't know about that. That was world news, literally. So, you know, with, you know, Marla Maples and Ivana and all of these people, like, if you lived in this country, I guarantee you've heard the name Donald Trump or whatever. And people have been asking him to run for president. So his history is out there. And for people to say, well, he didn't do anything racist, there's a lawsuit. He literally was sued by undocumented Polish folks. They were undocumented Polish folks who were building Trump Tower, and they weren't properly paid. So to also the undocumented situation, it's just like, oh, really? Okay.
They're Polish.
The Polish brigade. And so they sued him over not being paid properly. And so this has been going on with Trump for decades. So again, it is larger than Trump. It is a system that supports and protects people like Trump. And if we continue to be like, oh, we just need to vote the right person in, whatever, when they continue to support and uphold neoliberalism and support these austerity programs and support, you know, oh, well, you know, we're going to cut arts out of the schools. Okay, well, we're going to cut gym out of the schools now. And, you know, we're going to give you this particular type of learning when not everyone learns in that same way. And so we should know by now that these schools are tools to get you into the job market. That's all they are. So you can further be a wage slave. That's all they are. And so getting people back into, and I guess we could talk about the COVID now, but if you want to talk about that and upholding capitalism, this idea of getting people vaccinated has nothing to do with the well-being of people. All it is like, well, we need to open the markets back up. We need to continue profits, and we need to get your kids back into school so y'all could get back to your jobs and be wage slaves. So of course, they were freaking out because people were quitting en masse from McDonald's or whatever. It's just like, no, yeah. So it's like, we got to open the markets back up. We got to open the markets back up. And okay. CDC says y'all don't have to wear masks. Okay. Oh, now everybody got to wear masks because it's
Right.
okay. Come on. And so we look at more socialist countries when they had that shutdown. They're like, y'all ain't going nowhere. And you had countries which were like more democratic, socialist or whatever, or market-based social, whatever you want to call it, where they actually paid people to stay in their houses because they're like, look, yeah, we want things to get back, but this is how we're gonna do it, and y'all ain't gonna be happy or whatever. Like Italy, they were like breaking in stores or whatever, but that is how people did it. Like, they did that in Vietnam. It was like pretty much almost a total shutdown, and the rates were much lower than you had in this country, and you had in places like Brazil and places like India, where it's just like, okay. And notice how those places support more fascistic policies. So the places that support more fascistic policies over time in the midst of this pandemic have had higher rates of the COVID. And so, I think with also looking at, how vaccines are interpreted with the mistrust of the state, and I definitely mistrust the state. Again, we have to look at all of this dialectically, and the reason I'm putting it out there, looking at historically how Africans have been treated in the medical system, look at how folks in general, if we look at the foundation of gynecology, if we look at all of this stuff, Africans have been mistreated. If we look at the Tuskegee experiments, etc., we have to look at this dialectically. And people are like, well, they're just trying to kill us all. It's like, if this was, if they're trying to kill us all, why are they in Israel withholding vaccines from Palestinian folks? Why is it that the global South does not have access to vaccines? Why is it that if this was really about killing people, why is it that Cuba, it's sort of back and forth, but they don't have the syringes? They actually have the ability to vaccinate the population, but they don't have the syringes based on the embargo. So if this is really about killing people, I'm just looking again internationally, like we talked about before, making that connection about how capitalism affects all of us internationally. If this was really about eugenics, because Bill Gates straight up said on tape about the connection to vaccines and depopulation. But in this case, I don't know, because Bill Gates and crew are withholding vaccines around the world. So if this is really about depopulation, they would have been like, yeah, you get a vaccine and you get a vaccine, and if it was really about that. And also, one thing people don't talk about is the African connection in the history of the foundations of inoculations and vaccines. And so, and there is it's funny because, many of us have learned in school about cotton mather and, all this stuff, but we don't see the connection between cotton mather and African enslavement and vaccinations. So, and even beyond that, you had in China, in Africa, in Africa, there was a history of inoculations. And so it's people talk about vaccines and inoculations as if this is a modern phenomenon. And there's always, way before any of us were even thought of, there's been a system to make sure that mass diseases don't spread. And I feel like a large, like capitalism has massively confused us, and capitalism has again made these situations individual, as opposed to being like, well, you know, it's like understanding this is a very serious situation and we have to do the best that we can do. And you know, if you already start off from a loss, that's how people are going to approach this situation. And that's what's happening. So it's like, we got to get back to normal. So now you got the Rolling Loud Festival. You got people in Atlanta twerking in pools. Or you got, and people like, we just want to get back to normal. But it's just like, what is normal, first of all? And second of all, if y'all keep doing that, it's going to keep doing this. So we have to be strategic about this. And we have to think internationally as well. And you look at, again, countries which have done better versus countries which have not. So I know this is a very controversial subject, but it's also important to look at what happens in pandemics under socialism and capitalism.
And one point, and I'll go further along with the issue of the vid and and capitalism and such in the economy, like as we mentioned, talk about the new international division of labor, that way people talk about whether they're shutdowns or lockdowns or restrictions, quarantines and such, is that not everyone, like even especially during the early parts here in the snakes, that there are still people who had to work. There's still people who, as a result of, like, they call the essential workers, or we got to thank you for your service, or blah blah blah, and then you have the people like, oh, I want to get it back to normal, but then like there's for a lot of people, like, normal kind of sucked. And not only within, only here within the snake, but also like the division of labor to get some of the stuff you have to like feed your like alienated life, your alienated overconsumptive lifestyle. They still have, like, when they had to like back off, like when they couldn't have the markets, when they couldn't do their field work, they couldn't do their mining work, they couldn't, or at least they couldn't, like they had to reduce that, and that's affecting them. So all the clothing, the food, the services that you need, that we need, is that gonna, how are you gonna get, like, if you want, like, say if you want a new phone, you want some clothing, so like you need some pants, like some sweatpants, or you need to make some a smoothie for your shake or something. You need to get some fruit. How you gonna get that? You got a mill in the back. You got a farm. You have do you have a mine in your background? You can get some of that coltan. Can you do all that? No. It's like or if you want to order some pizza, you're like, oh, like, so like well, there's no robot, like, I know a certain company like tried it, but even so, like, that's someone who's from like Guatemala or someone from Mexico or something, they're gonna have to get that food, or someone from like Senegal, they're gonna have to get that food to you. So again, there's an issue of like with work just still going on, or just to keep your lights on, to keep your water going. Like, people still gotta do that, and that's not even getting to stuff that in this capitalist economy isn't counted as productive. Like, one thing to point out is that, especially now, like a lot of business like services shut down or limited because they don't want to catch a virus. A lot of the care work, a lot of like the labor, that caring labor, that domestic labor, such like that, there's more of that put on because capitalism relies on that. And not to mention like prison labor, it's like that, like talk about how think about how long like people want like free the people like these people like people here for 20 years for like stealing like $3 worth of candy, and they're still in there, like yeah. So so all this stuff, like they don't care, and even going to talk about vaccines, and this point, like even they even said like yeah, like there's a limit on vaccines as far as the intellectual property on it, but before like one of the things with Bill Gates is that he likes vaccines because like that point, like you can patent, like at least the system we have, you can patent the vaccine, you could accumulate all that money because I got this company makes all these vaccines, I can control the logistics of it, like giving these people clean water, giving these people like actual like ability to take care of their land and do something themselves. And but nah, let's just give them back. Let's put something, or if some vaccine doesn't work in say the UK, you just send it to Kenya, or you can send it to Bangladesh. And if there's like side effects to that, it's like whatever.
Yeah, I would say that in concerning the vaccine conversation, I think as you were mentioning, Jamilah and Evan, I mean, you got to be dialectical and understand that really out here in America is just to get people to work. I mean, they just want folks to work. That's why you got the campaigns going crazy, not really giving you a real forward analysis outside of, look, we need you to work. We don't need you to be at home. We don't need you to
get that $100.
Right. They're not getting another stimulus. Psh. You know, they like, look, the way to stimulate the economy is to get vaccinated so that you can work and not have to worry about posing these questions about Medicare. I was just watching a video of, I believe it was Corey Bush. I believe it was Matt Blumenthal, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He was outside talking about, what about Medicare for all? Like, this is the time to talk about it. And they had her Goonies come in like, yeah, she's tired right now. This isn't the time to talk about it. Write a note, get to this later, and it's just like the time right now. And I think we are in a time where more and more people, I am seeing that political education is happening, and more people are definitely being aware that we're in war here. And it's definitely not like the forces are not working overtime to combat that. So we just got to be understanding that, this thing it's been waged. You got to look at what's happening internationally. And make your perspective from there and not be reactionary. I think there's a lot of reactionary defense against it without looking into the historical aspects, which, that's not going to lead us in the right direction if we're operating from that framework. So we got to have our dialectical materialism strong.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things. So in terms of the intellectual property aspect of it, Cuba, how when people go to train to be doctors around the world, the role is to be a servant of the people. They're like, don't get this training and then be like, well, I'm a doctor and I have all these titles in front of my name and I'm going to connect with insurance companies. No, the role is to work for the people. And so you have Onesius, who is the name of the African who was enslaved and purchased by Cotton Mather. And he actually said, I want to help the people. And, here's how you inoculate folks or whatever. And then Cotton Mather said, hey, is that how you do it? And other Africans were like, yeah, because they learned from years of tradition that did go back to places like China, that did go back to places like Turkey, that did go back to places back home. And they said, okay. And then what happened? They were like, we're just going to take it and run with it. And this is the same thing that happens with the Gates Foundation. This is the same thing that happens with Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, who of course,
Rockefeller Foundation.
And so there was the woman, I'm forgetting her name right now, who's she was one of the heads of WellPoint Insurance. And so she was one of the folks that helped to compose the Affordable Care Act. And then she became an exec at Johnson & Johnson sometime later. I don't know if she's still there, but so just all of these things in terms of intellectual property, people around the world in the global south, people around in India, even though they have the capability of producing vaccines in Pakistan, but don't have like, it's just like, what is going on because of intellectual property? So if this is a pandemic worldwide, why would you hold intellectual property over this? Well, we have the patents. That literally makes no sense. So even when people are having anaphylactic shock, or you have to pay $2 billion just so you can stick yourself, it's just like, why not have generic drugs, quote unquote, generic drugs, so people can afford it? And so this is the same thing with these vaccines. I know here, in an effort to get people to take them, they've made them free. But I remember before they
free of how?
So we have incentives or whatever, but even before, with the testing, before they included it in the insurance, you had to pay $200 to get a COVID test. So there's always a catch. It's like, well, we have this pandemic, but you got to pay money in order to get tested. So people didn't get tested. And then there was a spread. And then, as you mentioned, it was essential workers. Thank you for your service. But, people coming in, I don't want to wear no mask. And so these essential workers are being exposed to folks that I'm freedom. Like, this is what people are exposed to. Not only are they exposed to rude customers, but they're potentially exposed to COVID. And
with no protection or no
right.
consideration. Yeah.
So now it's just like, well, and so here's the dialectical part. Now there's places where you have to get vaccinated in order to keep your job. And it's like, what if it's a place where you don't have insurance and it's not free? Like, now you have to fight with that. There's a war on the people, even in a pandemic. Why is the Gates Foundation, because of intellectual property and all these other corporations, withholding? This is the aspect why we're anti-capitalist. Everyone should have access to this. If you are serious about making sure that there's a flat rate, I'm not talking about financially, but if you want everything to be flat, then everyone has to have access. So either you make sure, if you ever have a shutdown, make sure that people have their material needs provided for. Obviously, that's not going to happen here, but that happened in other places. So it's really easy to see what a solution is for this thing, and then you work towards bigger solutions. But it's happened. This is empirical evidence. This is not anecdotal. People are speaking anecdotal. Well, I heard that, that when you get the vaccine, this, that, and that. It's just like, okay, we could discuss that. We could discuss the historical aspects of this. But what solutions do you have? If you want your freedom, you want to go to Rolling Loud or whatever, but then you got these conspiracy theories about, well, I'm not going to take it because Tuskegee. So give me a solution then. So again, I have a dialectical relationship to the vaccine issue personally, but I'm just talking in general, like, what is the solution if there is a distrust, and there should be a distrust? Like, what do you suggest we do? If you want to prevent a spread, what is your suggestion? You still want to be out here in these streets, but you don't have a solution. Like, that literally makes no sense. So, it's like people are like, I went on vacation in Hawaii and Mexico. It's just like, okay. So, you going out there being Rolling Loud or whatever, like, you're not doing any organizational work. You're not doing any work with the people. You out there as an individual. And freedom, I'm not going to wear a mask nowhere. It's just like, so what is your solution? And that is the thing. And we have to understand, yes, capitalism does drive why they want everybody to get vaccinated. Dialectically, is there a solution that we have? And so those are questions we need to be asking. This is not a for or against thing, but it's a very serious situation that's at stake right now. And the way people are out here acting, like, I don't think, I'm gonna say at least 2023, that's when you're gonna see it go down. But it's not, as for now, there's new variants coming out or whatever. So this is not, you know, being like, do this or do that. I'm just saying we have to look at not only the contradictions in the society we live in, but also for ourselves. Like, what solutions are we contributing to if we're really concerned about this? Our families, our loved ones, our friends, you know, a lot of us in one way or another have experienced either COVID ourselves or have known someone to get it. So how do we address this in a revolutionary way? How do we address this in a way that's not reactionary? And there's just too much of that. And people are not informed when they have these responses that are reactionary and making declarative statements with little information. So there's way too much of that going on, that I think it's important, like everything else, to make informed decision before you go out and do something. Don't just be like, well, they told me to get a vaccine, I'm gonna get one. Like, don't, you know, make informed decisions, do as much research as possible. And I'm also speaking personally as a person who literally lost a leg, and me being vegan and, you know, again, being as natural as possible and not taking meds or whatever. And in order for me to be in the position I am now, I had to take some stuff that I normally wouldn't. And so again, this is not being like, well, that's, I can't make that decision for you. But I'm just saying, for me personally, I went through something I never thought I was gonna go through. Like, I never thought I would have to take pharmaceuticals. I was anti-pharmaceutical. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I had to be like, oh, okay. All right, well, and I'm no longer on pharmaceuticals. And I think that is because of how I have taken care of myself over the years. But I was the person that was like, yo, I'm not gonna take pharmaceuticals or whatever. Like, if somebody needs that, that's fine. But my personal relationship with pharmaceuticals, I did not see them positively. And again, I had to experience taking pharmaceuticals. And so I have to look at this dialectically just for myself, but in general, I think we all should, and do as much research as possible and make informed decisions around this. And really, it's not the time to use conspiracy theory or declarative statements without information. We have to have the understanding that, yes, capitalism is driving a lot of this, but capitalism is also driving people's inability to get vaccinated right now. It's driving people's inability to have proper healthcare right now, outside of vaccinations. It's driving people's inability to properly be fed. And we're not making the connection when people are talking about vaccines. They're just talking about the snakes. They're not talking about how this pandemic, which is a pandemic, which means international, but people don't even call it a pandemic. People call it a plandemic, but even when people are talking about a pandemic, they're still talking about here. They're not talking about the world. And I think, and just like how people talk about socialism and communism individually and based on Eurocentrism, that's, I think, how people are addressing COVID, how they're addressing vaccines, and the whole world. Like, people are lining up like, we want to be vaccinated because we're workers. Like, people look at themselves like, we're workers, we're the masses. Here it's just like, well, I just want to go on my vacation. That is how people think of getting vaccinated or whatever. It's just like, again, the relationship to these things are very different than how it's thought of here in the snakes or in the West in general.
And a couple more things with regards to the relationship between excuse me, with regards to this and capitalism, is that so one of the things is it's been talked about good places, the climate and capitalism. It talks about the role of some of the newer these are what's it called, sort of newer diseases or newer strands of diseases coming about because of that increase of deforestation and as well colonization and capitalism, that some of these things that people would either not know, would not get in contact with, or maybe might not be used to. They're just like, oh, they're out because like the effects of just a mass drive to make nature a commodity, to like just take, and if it grows, like whatever, or even talk about like using all the like social distancing and like lockdowns and all that as a way to like transition to what's called the fourth industrial revolution, like capitalism, like trying to reform itself in a different way. So it's like even in that case, you'll get to work, but don't be surprised if Watson decides, bye, see ya, and then you're stuck with your Yang bucks. So, so yeah, like even in the midst of this, it's like they still like take opportunities to try to to use this like destructive nature of capitalism to profit from it, whether it's changing the way you work, the way you learn, like taking using the land that is available and just using that as just like space to look at, instead of like seeking like the people who are actually there, the indigenous people who are there, who like keep it as stewards. And like, and then even like we talk about like companies who are making vaccines, like it's like yeah, we want to help people, like what's the third quarter earnings, I want to know. And like and then or like they say here, like people who are actually who for whatever reason like they get affected by a vaccine, and it's like it's like, oh, you got affected by a vaccine, oh sorry, you can't oh sorry about that. And then it's like again, like that's again like all these different things come about. Or even if you hear like you talk about like how there's like people, there are like new reports are saying that that there were found like people who might have had COVID before. It's like, oh, like like the narratives like, oh, it's a wet market, it's like, oh, they're eating this, they're eating bats, this and or stuff. Like you said, by people, like there are other people like might have had it, or and that is like something like, oh, maybe it's from like some war game. And again, like the role of like militarism and I talk about the formation of the role of biological warfare there. And maybe that's something like again, like all like there's like so much about it. It's like about the system that's connected and trying to piece it together. It's just like something like it's like it gets too individualized. Either I like don't muzzle me, I want to be free, or oh, I'm a Pfizer girl, oh, I'm a Moderna man, oh this is, but like again, it's get like you get all these things that are like so individualist. But what about like being organized, like to make sure that you'd either have to deal with like all these new diseases, and if you do have to deal with them, that you don't have to rely on some a family of like Sacklers or like Rockefellers or someone to like profit off of it. Like, come on, profiting off the fact that people are getting better with this. Come on, like it's just.
Well, I think one of the things that came out of this particular pandemic is when they had the shutdowns around the world, there was less pollution. And so people are taking note of that. So you look at how industrialization and capitalism really are aligned, and how a lot of this modern technology and individualism feeds into that, into the pollution, into, again, wage slavery. All of these things are interconnected. And I started thinking about people talking about the RNA and the vaccines and how that's going to change your body composition. And I was like, wait, but a lot of things under capitalism already change your body composition.
Good point. I mean, the vaccine.
Advertising, what did they advertise? Cigarettes. They advertise all of these things when they said doctors smoke menthols or whatever, all these ads, when doctors, they said it's okay to smoke. And then it wasn't until years later and a lawsuit, we were like, okay, we have to put the Surgeon General warning. So to say that particular things, they're trying to sell these things and change our DNA and body composition, the food you eat, when you have that horrible reaction to the person who's trying to find your burger or whatever, and you're like, no. Like a lot of the food you eat changes your body composition. And so when you have the animal industry or whatever, and you're just going, and you're slicing and no feeling for the animals. And this is not like don't eat meat kind of, like, I'm not even going there. I'm just saying like the industry, the meat industry is based on inhumanity. It's cooping up animals, don't have any room to roam around, and they're in their own waste, and they're fighting each other, and they have to debeak chickens because chickens are out of their environment. And then you're taking kids away from their parents to make veal and all. So it's a very inhumane industry. And so when these animals are under a lot of stress, you're changing their body composition and you're taking that in. So you're also having your DNA altered by this negative energy that you're consuming. So to say like, oh, well, they're just trying to change it, like that's already happening with all the pollution like you look at African communities that are being changed because they're putting like dumpster areas in these communities and people can't breathe. People are getting asthma.
Lead paint, we still have lead paint in some places.
So to say that this one thing, oh, they're gonna alter people's DNA and transhumanism and all of it, this is already happening under capitalism with the things that are being consumed. If you're in front of a screen all day at your job, you don't think your DNA is being changed? Your skin is your biggest organ. You don't think it's taking in that energy? You do not decompress. What happens? You're in a computer all day and then you go in your house, what do? Sit down and watch TV. So your DNA is being altered no matter what you do under capitalism. And I think we really need to think about that. So this is, again, like, I'm not saying, yes, I've been vegan I've been eating meat like 30 years. So, obviously I am personally coming at that angle, and I've been vegan for like 27. So yeah, obviously I am passionate about this, but this isn't about don't eat meat or whatever, but what it is as an anti-capitalist, I understand that the industry is inhumane and they'll do whatever they do in order to profit. So why do you think a lot of these companies brought up organic foods companies, and switched up the recipe? Because they understand things are like, okay, oh, the people are looking more for organic food. They want healthier food. Okay, we'll buy up that company. So obviously they understand how things are changing your DNA. Like that's why, the social media changes your DNA as well. You're on there all day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your what do you call that? Dopamine levels are going up. So you don't think that's changing your DNA and your
gamification of stuff.
Right. So people don't think about that. They don't make connections between how DNA is already being altered by the food you eat, by the energy you take in when you're on social media all day, people being reactionary. All of that's changing your DNA, but it's like, oh, these vaccines, it's like, it's already happening. People.
That's the call to be scientific about it. Is to not just be like, all of these things are interconnected. It's not just, like you said, our skin is a big organ. It's the biggest organ. So all of it is connected. That we got to remember that we can't just isolate ourselves in these prisons of assumption and just feed off of the reactionary stimulation, because doesn't give us that fine tuning of analysis. That's for sure. It brings the point of being in an organization so that you have a process and that you be with others and you can have this critical process, and then you're not easily misled by even the stuff that comes on in your mind that you're thinking.
Yeah, and getting back to capitalism and the fact that most of us are not capitalists. We may support capitalism and think, well, it's, you can own a business or whatever. Again, if your labor is being exploited in any way, if you are a wage slave, you are not a capitalist. You do not have capital, extra money in which you can save while you're building your business. That is, again, why they had venture capitalists to be like, okay, and their role, like, if you're not doing well, they're going to pull their money because they're like, well, we want to see somebody who's going to do well. That is why we saw your plan. We think you're doing well. So we're going to front some money to you, but you got to give it back in some way. And that means by exploiting labor. So if you don't have the ability to do that, I don't care if you're a CEO, whatever, if you got to use a venture capitalist, and then once you get, to be a behemoth or whatever, if you are like Amazon, blah, 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 that's a different story. But most people are not capitalists. Most people, are usually, you are a worker, and what does that say? You are a worker and a consumer.
You are a worker and a consumer trying to be in false class solidarity with billionaires.
There it is. There it is. So you are either in the people's class or the anti-people's class. And that is what it's about. And if you are a person who, works 8, 9, 10, 11, 4 hours, whatever that is, and your labor is being exploited, you are not a capitalist. What are your class interests? You can identify with billionaires, but that doesn't
don't identify with you. I mean, unless they get your labor for your labor.
Right. So, the other thing is with capitalism, I think, people talk about, a huge thing that's been discussed is labor exploitation. So if you do not have the capacity to do that, again, if you are having your labor exploited, if you are paying the bank for your mortgage, if you're doing all of these things, you may have a business, but look what happened under this pandemic. A ton of people lost their jobs because they couldn't afford to either pay the rent because they couldn't run their business in the shutdown. So to say, because I own a business, I'm a capitalist, that literally makes no sense. You just lost your job. So I think people, again, intrinsically understand that there's a particular system that is a problem, but they do not identify it as capitalism in a lot of ways because I got a business. I'm going to get there someday. You have a job, like we have jobs, so we're all capitalists. So that literally makes no sense. And, thinking about people saying capitalism is trade, there's always been trade in one way or another. So you have barter system where you're not trading any money, and you had other forms of currency, but it wasn't fiat currency. So the fact that people are looking at simply fiat currency as being the only way you can trade something, that makes no sense whatsoever.
There've been gift economies too, and still are.
Mm-hmm.
Susu as well.
Exactly. And so to not look at the various levels of trade and people saying, well, there's always been capitalism. Again, there was feudalism, slavery, and there's capitalism, and there will be another system, and that will be a much better system. And we just need to understand that there's always going to be something better. There's got to be something better, because in times of struggle, there's resistance. And what may not look like resistance to people again, even if there's the little, well, man, I'm tired of my job, and people may not be in organizations, but you go to these different restaurants and all the workers quit. I mean, that's a big thing. And they have to put up a sign like, sorry, we're closed, all the workers quit. I mean,
that's happening more and more.
Exactly. So, and more of those folks are joining workers' unions. So it is happening. I am very optimistic that we're going to see a society that is devoid of capitalism. It may not be in our lifetime, but I really do believe that it's going to be a reality, because more and more people understand, whether to a small degree or an increasingly large degree, that capitalism is inhumane and it is not a sustainable system. I really see more and more people having that discussion. And even though the folks who speak the loudest are like, capitalism can work or whatever, but you see all these other people in the margins going, I don't know about that, because
right, we about to do something. We about to do something about that. We gonna do something about that.
right.
Yeah, like you see in so-called Los Angeles, they made homelessness illegal. If you honestly think that's a system that's worth, like they talk about they Cuba is such a total authoritarian, like they got rid of homeless, not like make it illegal, because actually people are able to have places to live. Right. Not it was just like sorry, you're gonna get evicted, and we don't like how all these people are around. We don't like these tenants to make that leave. I don't think that's like really like, you know, that's kind of like a authoritarian right there.
So you have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. You have a high rate medical system where doctors around the world provide service to the people. You have houselessness is pretty much non-existent, and people go, that's totalitarianism. I can't believe it. People don't have freedom.
My grandparents had to leave.
But yet, you step over the houseless person.
Right.
And people, I don't know when I'm going to get my next meal. Like, how is
I wonder, right. When do I? Capitalism is the enemy and it must be destroyed. And that's the war we're waging against it. Ideological war against capitalism and its forms, from neoliberalism to neocolonialism, patriarchy, all of these isms against humanity. We going against it. We ain't having it.
everybody, amen. Capitalism, away from me, amen. Everybody, capitalism, let's go, everybody. Capitalism, let's go, everybody.
It's gonna be done.
Capitalism,
amen. Amen.
I got some final words for this episode.
Yeah.
Well, as we say, please, you got to join an organization or build your own organization if you're not satisfied with any of the organizations that exist. That's the only way we can fight these systems together with a unified collective mind. I mean, that's one of the best things you can do for yourself, is to be involved in the process. Reach out to us if you're interested. We can give you all of that information.
Yeah, and study the history. Discuss with people who know. Discuss with people. Listen. Always take into account what's happening. Act on what you learn, and organize people.
Yes, and don't believe everything we say. We have lived a lot of what we're talking about, and we have studied a lot of what we're talking about. But there is a source list that we list every week. I know a lot of people don't look at the description when they look at these videos.
Read the description. Yeah.
There is a list of sources where we have read this material. Again, we have a work study process. A lot of us have read this material outside of that work study process, but it is important to have an organized work study process so we have an analysis. This is of utmost importance to do that work, because we are at ideological war. And anybody who tells you we don't need to read, we out here, and it's just like, any revolutionary movements had an ideological program to prepare you for getting out in these streets. So don't just be like, nope. Is this real life out here? And capitalism also has an ideological program, and we're all living it, and we're working to, turn the wheels in the other direction. Right. The wheels are here, and the cogs are like, but we're here to put some oil on the cogs and go, okay, fresh. Now we're moving faster in the revolution against this ideological war. So that's what we're about. So please join our organization. Please study so we can be prepared to fight this ideological war against capitalism every day, all day. And we want to do this preparation for people in future generations, because we're not going to be here. We honor ancestors every single time. They did that work so we could be here today. So we're doing that work. So future generations, they see that work we did and they continue that work. That's what it's about. Revolution is ongoing every day, all day. So let's get it. Come on, join an organization. If you don't like this one, make one yourself, join another one. Because that's what it's about.
And don't forget to check out all our comrades who got their own podcasts, who they're going to say the same thing. They're going to might have some like different things, but they're going to say the same thing. Join the organization of our comrades of John Mushakura. They're doing their weekly webinars every Sunday out on the West Coast. We got the Forward Ever podcast you mentioned. We got the weekly Pan-African news for with Osanwu and peeps out there in so-called New Mexico, Tiwa territory. We also got the Revolution African Women's podcast that happens monthly. So check those out. And again, don't just listen. Like, if you want to listen, great. Don't just listen. Apply what you'll see, discuss, plan off some folks and do the thing. Do it all.
Don't be a passive listener, be an active organizer.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's it. Forward.
Whatever, backwards.
Backwards.
Never.
All right.